One private company, headquartered in Geneva, moves more cargo across the world's oceans than the entire United States Navy has ships to patrol. That company is MSC, Mediterranean Shipping Company. And in 2023, it quietly overtook Maersk to become the largest container shipping operator on Earth, controlling over 19% of all global container capacity. That means roughly 1 in 5 of every product you have ever bought, every component inside your phone, every piece of furniture in your home, every medication in your cabinet. At some point in its journey, it was almost certainly aboard an MSC vessel. You have never heard of them. That is not an accident. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how a family from Naples built a monopoly over the arteries of world trade, operating in plain sight, hiding in the complexity of an industry nobody watches, and why that should concern every government, every consumer, and every business on the planet. Most people imagine global trade as a vast, competitive network. Thousands of companies, ships, and routes, all kept honest by market forces and overseen by international regulators. Goods flow, prices adjust. No single player gets too powerful. That is a version of the world that appears in economics textbooks. Here is a version that appears in shipping data. The top 4 container shipping companies, MSC, Maersk, CMA CGM, and COSCO, now control approximately 60% of all global container shipping capacity. But the concentration goes deeper than market share. Through a web of shipping alliances, port terminal ownership, freight forwarding acquisitions, and logistics subsidiaries, these same companies control the physical infrastructure through which goods must pass before they ever reach a port. The choke points are not at sea. They are on land, in terminals, warehouses, and digital booking systems that most businesses have no choice but to use. The specific mechanism is this. Container shipping is a natural oligopoly because the capital cost of entry, a single large container vessel costs $200 million, makes genuine competition almost impossible. Once you are big enough to offer global coverage, you become indispensable. And once you are indispensable, you set the terms. One family understood this before any regulator did, and they spent 50 years making themselves impossible to remove. The story begins in 1970 in Naples with a man named Gianluigi Aponte and a single second-hand cargo vessel called the Patricia. Aponte was not a financier. He was a ship captain who had spent years working for other people's companies and concluded, simply, that he could run it better. He bought the Patricia for a modest sum, launched a route between the Mediterranean and Somalia, and named his company after the sea he knew best. His motivation was not ideology. It was control. Aponte wanted to own the infrastructure, not rent it. From a very first vessel, every dollar profit went back into acquiring more ships. No dividends. No outside investors. No IPO. The company would remain private. A decision that, 50 years later, makes MSC uniquely opaque in an industry that is already poorly understood. The opposing force was the market itself. In the 1970s and 80s, container shipping was dominated by established European and Asian operators. Maersk had already been operating for decades, and Japanese and Korean conglomerates had deep state backing. MSC was an upstart with Mediterranean routes and limited capital. It should have been absorbed or crushed. Instead, Aponte did something counterintuitive during every industry downturn. He bought. When freight rates collapsed in the early 1980s, when the Asian financial crisis hammered shipping in the late 1990s, when the post-2008 recession cratered global trade volumes, MSC acquired vessels, routes, and terminal stakes at distressed prices while competitors retrenched. By 2004, MSC had 200 ships. By 2014, 470 ships. By 2024, the fleet exceeded 760 vessels, with a combined capacity of over 5.7 million TEUs. A TEU is a 20-foot equivalent unit, a standard container. Stack MSC's capacity end to end, and you have a column of containers that would circle the Earth more than twice. Here is a number that stops most people cold. In 2021 and 2022, at the height of the pandemic shipping crisis, MSC and the other major carriers collectively earned an estimated $300 billion in net profit in just 2 years. That is more than the GDP of Finland, Portugal, and New Zealand combined. The same companies that raised shipping rates by 600% during a global supply chain emergency, when no business had any alternative, were recording the most profitable 2 years in the history of commercial shipping. Not one government had the regulatory authority to stop them. The story most people know is the 2021 supply chain crisis. Ports backed up, shipping rates exploded. A single 40-foot container from Shanghai to Los Angeles went from $2,000 in early 2020 to over $20,000 by late 2021. Shelves emptied. Inflation spiked. Businesses that had built just-in-time supply chains collapsed under costs they had no ability to forecast or absorb. That is the headline. What most analysts missed, and what MSC understood perfectly, is that container shipping is not just a transport business anymore. It is an information business. When MSC acquired Hamburg Sud in 2017 for $4 billion, and when it subsequently moved aggressively into freight forwarding through its logistics arm, it wasn't just buying ships and routes. It was buying data. Every booking, every cargo manifest, every routing decision feeds into proprietary systems that tell MSC, before any government trade body, before any competitor, where global demand is building, where supply chains are under stress, and where rates are about to move. The company that owns the ship also owns a forecast. That is a structural information advantage that no regulator currently has the tools to address. In 2023, MSC and Maersk announced the dissolution of their 2M alliance, a vessel sharing agreement that had, paradoxically, been the most visible form of coordination regulators could monitor. What replaced it was something more diffuse and harder to scrutinize, a fragmented system of bilateral agreements, terminal co-investments, and digital platform integrations that achieve the same economic outcome as the alliance without triggering the same legal scrutiny. The Federal Maritime Commission in the United States and the European Commission have both launched investigations into carrier pricing practices. Neither has produced binding remedies. The industry moves faster than the regulatory cycle. If you run a small business that imports or exports goods, you have no negotiating power with MSC. You book through a freight forwarder who books through a digital platform that MSC partly owns. The rate you pay is whatever the algorithm sets on the day you need the space. During the pandemic crisis, thousands of small and medium businesses across Europe, the United States, and Asia reported being bumped from confirmed bookings. Cargo left on docks while vessels sailed partially empty because the carriers had calculated that rolling the booking was more profitable than honoring it. The formal complaint process takes months. The cargo waits on the dock regardless. You have been watching a story about shipping, about a family business that became a global giant, about market concentration and regulatory failure and pandemic profiteering. But this story was never about shipping. It was always about sovereignty and the quiet transfer of it from governments to private infrastructure owners. Here's a reframe. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, the first institutions to impose economic consequences were not governments. Maersk suspended shipments to Russia on February 28, 2 days after the invasion. MSC followed within 24 hours. Between them, those two decisions cut Russia off from a substantial portion of its container trade before any Western government had passed a single sanctions package. Two private companies, owned by two families, made geopolitical decisions with consequences that rivaled government action. That is not a coincidence. That is a logical endpoint of allowing private companies to own critical infrastructure. When you control the ships, the terminals, the booking platforms, and the data, you control something that looks less like a business and more like a state function. The twist is this. We spent decades worrying about nation-states weaponizing trade. We built the WTO, the IMF, and a vast architecture of multilateral agreements to prevent governments from using economic access as a geopolitical weapon. We never wrote a rule for what happens when a family in Geneva can do the same thing, faster, more quietly, and without a single vote being cast. MSC did not seize power. The power was left unattended, and they simply picked it up. We began with one private company moving more cargo than the United States Navy has ships to patrol. Here's the close of that loop. In 2024, MSC placed orders for additional vessels that will add another 1 million TEUs to its capacity, roughly equivalent to the entire fleet of the world's 10th largest shipping company. While regulators debate the last crisis, the next layer of concentration is already being bolted into the hull. The most powerful choke points in the global economy are not the Strait of Hormuz or the South China Sea. They're the booking systems, terminal leases, and vessel schedules of 3 or 4 private companies that most people cannot name. And here's the question that no institution has yet seriously answered. When a single-family shipping company becomes so large that its decisions affect the food prices, medicine availability, and economic stability of entire nations, at what point does a private business become a public utility? At what point does the world need a different answer? That question is coming. The only uncertainty is whether governments will ask it before the next crisis forces the answer.